I am Margareta Fischer, an auxiliary from a Luftwaffe signal unit, who spent too long repeating instructions I did not examine. The first American paper that carried my name in Texas was not a visa. It was a plain green library card held at fence height outside a temporary camp near San Angelo. A cream bookmobile idled under pecan trees. A guard in a bent cowboy hat stood beside a crate of Coca-Cola that sweated through the wood. He kept one eye on the ledger and one eye on the wire. He stated that books could not cross and that only hands could meet the rule. The librarian, Helen Whitfield, did not challenge the rule. She kept the process simple. She asked for a name, a preference, a day of the week. I had warned other women for months that American friendliness was a tactic, that music and small comforts were the outer layer of a trap, and that libraries inside enemy lines must be avoided. I did not plan to answer. My voice is named poetry anyway. The green card showed a single word, stamped in the same color as the stock. Good. The word did not match the fence or the season, but the record started there all the same. I did not receive a book in my hand. The rule prevented that. Helen built a routine that did not break the rule. Thursdays, titles spoken through the wire, pages read aloud where the guard could hear each line, a ledger that recorded date, title, page, start, and finish. I had trained myself to mistrust systems that promised improvement. I still recognized the order when I saw it. The pamphlets I had distributed in Europe described the United States as chaotic and mean. The orchard, the schedule, and the ledger showed a different picture in simple entries and stamps. I had been captured near Brest during a retreat that ended without drama, processed by men who kept lists, sent to a port, and shipped across the Atlantic in a hold that smelled of rust and rope. I stepped into Texas under a sky that did not end in any direction. The camp sat on the edge of town in view of a billboard that sold peaches. The heat put dust on the skin and stayed. We picked pecans when assigned, folded hospital laundry when ordered, and carried our weight between lines of wire. Trains moved at night and marked the hours. I kept my back straight in the mess tent, and my mouth set in the old lines, and I refused the bottles in the glowing green crate, because refusal had become my posture. Then the bookmobile parked under the trees, and a hand held up that green square an inch from the fence, and my name moved into a new column. The guard responsible for our section paid attention without theater. Each morning he met us with empty hands raised to show his intent. He logged our sessions in a ruled notebook. He kept his date stamp in a tin and practiced until the digits lined up. He wrote in the margin when a pause for laughter happened, and when silence lasted longer than normal. He never stepped closer than the post allowed. On Sundays, he exercised a chestnut mare called Ruby along the road outside the outer fence. He trained her by circles that tightened and widened, and by simple words. He did not ask me to touch the animal. He looked from his eyes to her leg to my hand on the wire until I understood to match her step by pressure and release. Up and down, steady, no rush, no display. I learned where to place my fingers so the wire did not cut the skin, and so the rhythm stayed even. The movement altered the day more than I expected. Inside the barracks, I organized my thoughts by writing on laundry chits and ration slips. I noted 3 details from each Thursday, a paragraph that changed my breathing, a sentence that held in the air longer than the others, and a sound from outside the fence that tried to interrupt. I also noted the Coca-Cola crate beside the guard's chair, the hinge on the bookmobile door that made a short squeak, and the way the librarian's pencil left clean marks on the cardstock. I did not change my mind in 1 hour. I added facts and kept them in order. The women around me watched my movement toward the fence with mixed reactions. Some approved without saying so. Some kept their distance. One younger woman admitted that she could not find the third beat in the Texas waltz that came through the radio at night. I told her that the third beat keeps the body from tipping forward and that practice solves the problem. We left the comment there and moved on with the work. The ritual hardened into a schedule. The guard unfolded the chair at the same place. The bookmobile arrived at the same time. Helen opened her bag, took out the stamp, and recorded our progress in neat rows. The card with my name collected dates and page numbers. The guard added a line he called temperatures of the soul. It was a simple code for held breath, smile, frown, and distraction. The entry did not change the rule. It changed the record. When Helen read, she did not perform. She delivered the text at a pace that allowed me to follow in a second language. A story about a river boy who learned to tell the truth through action took hold. A waltz on a record in a listening room downtown appeared in her description as a tool for calm rather than an ornament. The pecan leaves made basic noise in the wind. The fence stayed in place and still allowed voices to meet on schedule. I told myself that kindness without a receipt was dangerous. This kindness kept receipts. The orchard began to show the signs of a late summer shift. The heat stayed, but the light changed shape by a small margin. I kept the green card under my pillow, then in my shoe, then in a seam in the hem, because I had learned to hold on to the thing that set the rules for the next day. The guard's hat did not change its bend, and his greeting did not change its content. Ruby's step did not change its count. My resistance thinned where the ledger grew. The old doctrine in my head stayed active and sometimes grew louder in the quiet. I brought it to the fence and used it to test each new entry. So far, the entries remained stable. The weeks built a private timeline that I could read in the marks on paper and in the repetition of small actions. On the first line of that timeline stands the day the librarian asked what I liked to read and wrote poetry next to my name without any hesitation. The second line holds the first time the guard added a separate column for pauses and for changes in voice. The third line notes the morning when Ruby lowered her head on command, and the guard signaled me to lower my hand at the same time so the steps stayed aligned. The work inside the camp continued as usual. We sorted sheets, counted items, and turned piles into stacks. I used the mental quiet of those tasks to review the stories read at the fence. The river, the waltz, the boy, the choice. I had no sermon left that fit the data. The listening room in town had a chair, a small table, and a record player with a needle that had to be lowered with a steady hand. Helen described the rules for that room in practical terms. 30 minutes on a schedule. No talking once the record began. Sign the log before and after. When she listed the available records, I recognized the name of a Texas waltz that I had heard on the radio in the barracks and felt my chest settle to a consistent rate. The guard noted the effect without comment. He wrote steady in the margin and underlined it once. He made jokes in the ledger that stayed within the rule. On a morning when a tumbleweed stuck in the fence, he wrote, "Interruption botanical." On another morning, he wrote a lesson unmounted when Ruby and I matched steps exactly. The jokes did not erase the fence. They kept attention where it belonged. The camp had internal tensions that did not disappear because of books or music. A few women kept to an older line and warned others against collaboration of any kind. The command separated the most aggressive voices and sent them to a different facility. The rest of us returned to the schedule. I did not convert to a new set of slogans. I pushed the old set out of the way by counting what happened and what did not. The ledger helped. So did the way the guard raised his empty hands each morning before he picked up his pencil. A dust storm arrived on a Thursday that started clear. The first sign was a yellowing at the edge of the sky. The pecan trees moved in a way that meant labor rather than breeze. The bookmobile gave 2 short horn taps at the bend in the orchard road and then went quiet. We were on laundry duty. The guard passed out bandanas and directed us to crouch in place. The dust cut through every gap. I thought of Helen and the bookmobile sitting exposed in the open lane. I left the trench, pulled the cloth over my mouth, and moved toward the orchard with my head down. A call followed me from the line. I kept going. The bookmobile stood with its door cracked for air. Helen had tied back her hair with a green strip. She gestured low breathing and a lower profile. We crouched with our backs to the wind and used the fence as a barrier. Wire air bodies order. The sequence worked. She took a small green card from her bag and pushed it through a diamond in the wire. The card read in plain pencil, "Green card for fence reading," followed by my name. The stamp had landed twice. Good. The entry matched the old entries in color and weight. I took the card and felt the wire leave a clear line in my palm. The bookmobile door shut to protect the shelves. We waited for the worst to pass. When the light returned to a normal shade, the guard walked the line with his hat in his hand. He checked for injuries first. He saw the cut on my palm. He opened a Coca-Cola, handed it to me, and waited until I drank. The cold was sharp and real. He recorded the day in the ledger as weather interfered and drew a small bottle in the margin that he turned into a music note when he saw himself getting sentimental. Helen wrote the date on the new card and pressed her nail gently on the 3 pencil notes she had drawn beneath the line marked "Listening." The dust stayed in our ears for hours. The books carried grit in their covers. I felt lighter in a way I could define. I had a card I could present, a schedule I could keep, and a rule that had held in wind and heat. At night, I did not blame myself for relief. I wrote a simple conclusion on a scrap and folded it into the hem near the card. The paper did not make me special. It made me responsible for showing up. It tied my name to a practice in daylight that could not be called conspiracy because the guard kept the records and the librarian kept the dates. The old voice in my head returned and asked hard questions as usual. I put it to work. Count the Thursdays. List the titles. Match each kindness with the public record that contained it. The sums came out even. The following week, the orchard looked clean again. We met at the fence at the usual time. Helen finished the river story on a point where loyalty rested on law rather than replaced it. The guard did not write during the last page. He kept his pencil still until the cover closed. We sat without movement for 5 seconds more, and then returned to the schedule. I stitched the new card into my hem before I went to sleep. The cut on my palm dried to a pale line. Ruby passed the outer road in a slow walk and lifted her head in a way that looked intentional rather than decorative. I kept time on the fence post with my fingers. Up, down, up. Type. The war ended in pieces in our barracks and then all at once on a posted notice. Men left first, then groups of women. The camp emptied in a pattern that made sense only on the board in the office. We waited in the meantime. Waiting became a job. Breathe smaller. Move work along. Save energy for a real instruction. The green card stayed in the seam. I checked it at night and in the morning. The guard kept the ledger up to date until the last line he was assigned to write. Helen kept the Thursday appointment until our names left the list. On our last morning, the guard stood with his hands empty as usual and then touched the brim of his hat. Ruby stood saddled at the far road. The bookmobile did not come that day. Helen arrived on foot with a paper sack. She placed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper in my hands and an envelope with my name written in clear schoolroom print. She said that the envelope was for later by pointing from the paper to my bag and then to the timepiece on her wrist. We stayed a minute longer than necessary and then moved toward the truck when told. The road out of the orchard curved in a way I knew by then. I lifted my palm and held it toward the place where Helen stood. She lifted hers. No contact, no breach. The gesture still held the content of the habit we had formed. At the bend, the fence stayed in place and carried nothing except its weight. The sky looked larger because I knew how to read the appointments that happened below it. The train took us east. The ship took us home. Bremerhaven smelled of coal and salt and work. Hamburg had long streets of rubble and small rooms full of relatives. I found a job in a bendery behind a paper shop that sold stock we could not waste. We repaired old volumes, stitched signatures, glued spines, and pressed titles in thin foil. The green card lived in a tin with needles and thread. At night I took it out, placed its 3 penciled notes under the scar on my palm, and re-established the count. Up, down, up. I wrote letters with generic headings. To my mother, to my father, to a librarian in Texas, to myself. I folded them and kept them under the tin lid. I did not send the card because the seam felt essential, and because I wanted the object near my work. Winter did what winters do. The postman brought a large envelope with Texas in the corner. Inside lay a photograph of a cream bookmobile under pecans. The guard stood with Ruby's bridle. The handwriting on the back said that the fence remained in place, that children liked the donkey book more than the others, that the listening room had added records, and that the guard's stamp had improved its alignment. The note used plain words. I put the picture in the cash drawer under the change. I did not become a symbol. I became punctual. A factory down the river fixed radios. On Fridays, I delivered a small batch of working sets and set my hand on the warm cases until they cooled. Years removed the sharp edges from the dates. A librarian in my district heard a version of my story and showed me their listening room. I booked 30 minutes, lowered the needle, and sat with a Texas waltz that needed no translation. The middle beat carried the other 2. I signed the log with initials and wrote practice on the line below. I declined to lecture. I preferred to show up. In time, I returned to Texas because repetition finishes a habit. My daughter, Mina, was old enough to understand what she saw. We flew west. The town near the old camp had grown. The orchard had fewer trees. The library had more windows. A modest plaque at the campsite used correct nouns. The building inside held cool air and the quiet of paper. A young archivist named Marie examined my card as if it were a small living thing that needed care. She asked if we would like to donate it. She said our names could be cataloged and the fence noted in the record. I did not chase drama. I asked to see where the cards lived. Downstairs we saw labeled boxes, a ledger with fading ink photographs of the trees and green cards with worn edges. One said returned late, baby early. Another said to renew if the river keeps rising. Another said child prefers the donkey again. I set my card among them and watched Marie add a line to a caption. I did not write a speech. I asked her to print a sentence I had tested for years. Freedom is a habit. If there is room, thank the librarian who taught me to practice. We filled out a donor form. Mina took a photograph of my hand on the glass. The old scar on my palm showed as a thin, pale line. Upstairs, a vending machine hummed. I bought a Coca-Cola. We stepped into the evening. A man in a cowboy hat crossed the lot and lifted his hand in an empty greeting. The air shifted 2 degrees toward ease. Mina asked whether I had ever ridden a horse there. I said that I had learned to keep a step through a fence. We counted 3 under our breath as we walked. At the hotel, I opened plain stationery from the library. I began a letter to Helen and then crossed out the form of address and used her name. I recorded the facts. The card sat under glass with others. A caption held a sentence we had lived. The guard's stamp had outlasted the weather. The listening room had done its work. I did not dramatize the dust storm. I wrote the steps that worked. Crouch low. Share a seam of shelter. Breathe steady. Keep rules that protect both sides. Use paper where paper is allowed to travel. Share weight when weight must move. I finished with a series of events that changed me. a librarian who kept appointments, a guard who raised empty hands, a horse named Ruby who taught rhythm across a fence line, a crate of Coca-Cola that became in practice first aid, a small card stamped good in green that matched its stock and stayed true under review. I signed my name and stored the letter. I knew where it belonged. Mina asked for one more drive through the Orchard Road before leaving. We parked by the old fence line that now holds only sky. The wire glinted in the sun. The pecans stood in stable rows. I raised my hand over the spot where two shadows had once met. The gesture worked without another person present because the habit lived in the body. Mina took a picture. The arm in the frame looked younger than the rest of me because practice reduces strain. On the flight home, I kept the unsent letter in my bag. Some papers go to archives. Some stay with the person who is still using them. Back at the bindery, I showed Mina how to hinge a cover and how to move glue so it spread without tearing the paper. We turned on a radio for company. A waltz came through the speaker. Mina asked why 3 feels easier than 2 once you learn it. I said that 2 pulled too hard and that 3 gives room to reset while moving. She repeated the count on the table with her hand. When she missed the 3rd beat, I placed her fingers back on the bar. She listened. Sometimes the old pamphlet voice returns and asks whether music and books and soft drinks during a war are a trick. I let the voice finish and then ask it to check the records. The ledger, the stamps, the dates, the rules that kept us honest. In daylight, the way law and kindness met without drama. Suspicion can do work when it stays with facts. When I pass the mirror, I see the old guard on my face and the new librarian behind the eyes. I lift my hand in the empty greeting I learned at a fence. The count returns on its own, up, down, up. The last picture I keep in my head is not the bookmobile or the storm or the glass case. It is a horse I did not ride, setting a pace I could keep from the other side of the wire. It is a woman who kept the calendar open and wrote my name with care. It is a ledger that included jokes and still did its job. It is 3 notes in pencil. It is Thursday after Thursday, carried out in public. The instruction I pass on is plain. Borrow with attention. Return on time. Practice on uneventful days. Greet with empty hands. Leave a place more usable than you found it. When dust rises, go low. Make shelter breathe where you can and pass a card through any legal opening that remains. On our last night in Texas, Mina asked whether I missed the card now that it lived under glass. I answered that the shelf belonged to me as much as the card ever had because a public record protects the habit better than a seam in a skirt. We crossed the hotel lobby, counting to 3 in our heads, and I heard in memory the sentence that started the work. We will find a way. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more untold human-scale Biwadyu Cow narratives on our YouTube channel, and share it with someone who needs steady courage.